We will do some prashasti for you and some qasida, and then the whole afternoon will be for yours to run through the horses.
So yeah, good afternoon everyone. It's nice to see you all here in this afternoon, and I on behalf of the seminar committee welcome you all with a very warm heart. So today we have for this afternoon Dr. Eva Orthmann, Professor of Iranian Studies at the University of Göttingen. Dr. Orthmann was previously the Professor of Islamic Studies at the very prestigious University of Bonn. She has also been a visiting research scholar at the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Yale. Her research interest and teaching interest include the Mughal Empire, astrology, Ismailis, and a variety of other associated things related with the history of India and Iran. She is speaking today on Indo-Persian treatises on horses. Now I would request Professor Omar Farooqi sir to kindly chair the talk, and we also are very honored to have Professor Chandrasekhar from the Persian department as our dear guest of honor. So I welcome you all. Thank you.
I do not use this chair, so if somebody wants to sit. First of all, thank you so much.
She doesn't need it.
But I need a little bit of space.
Yes.
Can have the chair, but not the space. So, thank you so much for inviting me to give a talk here this afternoon. And actually, it's the last talk I'm giving here in India before returning to Germany on the weekend. And when we had been discussing about what to talk, I was asked to talk about horses, and this is, and I want to say so immediately at the beginning, very much work in progress, because I really had to change my talk after every visit to the library here. I've been in so many manuscript departments in the last weeks, and in every department I found new horse treatises, and some confirmed what I was knowing already or thinking to know already, and some, changed my opinion. So I had really to change the lecture several times, and this will be obvious. And so it is not, let's say, a finalized talk, but it's work in progress. And maybe why horses? Horses are, of course, or have been of major importance in many, many regions of the world and in many cultures. And in regions in which I'm interested in, of course, we find horse treatises in the Arabic, we find horse treatises in Persian, in Turkic, but also in several Indian languages. And we have a very important Indian tradition of horse treatises going back to the Shali, and that's what I'm mostly going to talk about. Why are horses so important? Of course, the primary function is to be used in that. Is what we find in the treatises again and again, and we find sections on horses also included in treatises which are more talking about war. And of course, the second use of horses is for representation. That's another function which is very important. And it's also used for hunting and for the polo game. And these functions are all dealt with in the treatises, but the war is, I would say, the most important one, the most obvious one. And of course, because of this importance for war, we find information about horses also in other material. We find it in historiographical material, of course, and we find it also in some documentary evidence. There are some social material we find in Hyderabad, in the Arcas, but I'm not going to talk about that today. Today I'm really only talking about this tradition of horse treatises, so books meant to be dealing with horses. And so if we look at India, horses came from different regions. Many horses have been, or most of the horses have been imported, and the imported horses sources were considered of higher quality. So we have imports from Central Asia, but also from the Gulf region, from the Arab Peninsula, and we have some local readings, and these are differentiated in the terminology. The imported courses were considered of higher quality, but of course they were also more expensive, and there was a problem with imported horses because these horses came, let's say, from another background, so they were not used to the Indian climate, and they were not used to the Indian fodder and feeding. And so for people using horses, or especially using imported horses, it was important to know the local traditions about veterinary medicine and also how to breed horses here in this climate. So that is why we find here in India, let's say, two types or maybe more types of treatises on horses. We have on the one hand treatises which are very much related to the Arabic, Persian and Turkic Islamic tradition on horses. And I will show you and talk about one or maybe two of these treatises. I thought it's one, but since 2 days I know it's more rather two. But these treatises were interesting, they were important, but they were not sufficient because in these treatises, of course, you do not find information about the Indian climate and the Indian veterinary knowledge. So people, and especially also, let's say, the different Islamic dynasties who came to India were very much interested in the local horse tradition, and this local tradition is very much related to what is called the Shalihota tradition, a tradition going back to an Indian sage who might have lived or might not have lived. And here, for this reason, the entire topic of the horse treatises is very much related to the much broader topic of Indo-Persian translations. So now here we come to the topic of translations, and since I'm not sure you all have background knowledge about that, I thought let me say some words before coming back to Shalihota about the Indo-Persian translation movement, which is a very long movement or a very long tradition of translating texts from Sanskrit, but also from other Indian languages into Persian. So most of the translations, or probably most of the translations, have been done from Sanskrit into Persian, but there are also other Indian languages, and often, and we will see that in a short time, other Indian languages were used as intermediate translations, and we have only a very few translations done in the other direction from Persian into Sanskrit, most of them related to astronomy. So Persian Sanskrit is rare, it's not very common, and mostly in the field of astronomy, astrology. The texts generally cover very different topics, and let me just briefly show you the classification Carl Ernst from Chatham Hill has done, which is still a very useful classification. So we have what is related to practical arts and sciences, which is the earliest section or the earliest part of translations which have been done starting in the Sultanate period, and this can very much be compared to, let's say, similar translation movements we have in the Islamic world, especially the Greco-Arabic translation movement. And so people maybe like me who have been trained in Islamic studies, I come from the Greco-Arabic translation studies, and so this in a certain period can mostly really be connected to it. While what then happens in India is is different, maybe even more interesting, because then we have the translation of historical and political texts taking place in the Mughal period, mostly We have the metaphysical and mystical texts related to Darashiko, but not only. We have also earlier texts. So let's say it is the most important period for translating this text is during the time of Darashiko, but it's not exclusively during his time. And we have the Indo-Persian texts from the colonial era, which have not been studied much. So this is the less studied part. So what I'm going to talk about is mostly these practical arts and sciences going back to the Sultanate period, and I just briefly show you the website of Proso Indica, which is a project dealing with these translations. So what is challenging and what is really different also from the Greco-Arabic part is that for many translations we do not really have the source text. And that makes it difficult. How do you judge and how you deal with a translation or a text who pretends to be a translation when you do not have the original text in the original language, but only the source text. And we will see that in the case of the Shalihotra, because this is really a challenging question. And I will try to explain you the challenges going along with that on two examples, or especially one example. What makes it also difficult is that many translations are not very exact. So we have translations which are really very exact. So you can see this is the Sanskrit text, this is the Persian text, and you can compare more or less every word with the other and see, okay, this is the same text. This is, for example, the case with the Bratsamhita, a text on astronomy, astrology, and omens. There, the comparison is easy. But, and it is really an exact translation, more or less. But in other translations, there are many discrepancies, and these discrepancies are not because the people didn't know how to translate, but because obviously they wanted to adapt the source text to their cultural environment and just change it or to their political, ideological intentions. And this is what we find very much in the period of Akbar and the Mughal translations with, for example, the Mahabharata text. And it's interesting because these discrepancies have been severely criticized in the colonial period when William Jones said, oh, they just didn't know how to translate. But this was because he was expecting an exact translation. And this was obviously not what the people wanted to do. So, in the scientific texts, we have variegated approach. We have exact translations, as in the case of the Bratsamhitas, also in many medical texts. But in the medical texts, we have changes and adaptations to the Persian medical system. That's a very interesting topic, on which Fabrizio Speciale has very much worked. So you have to be very careful when you read an Indo-Persian medical text, because the vocabulary sounds like the vocabulary for a Persian text, but the meaning is different. But what we have in the Horst treatises seems to be again another challenge, because it is a kind of living tradition, so the texts change constantly. And this makes it difficult to decide what you are not only not having the source text, but you also do not know what was the Tajik text looking at the beginning like, because it has so much changed afterwards. So you are comparing two unknown things. But let us now go to this region, to the Bahmani court, and I will very briefly talk about one text which seems to be, this is preliminary knowledge, so I don't know if I will say the same in 10 weeks, but now I say so. It seems to be a text very much related to the Arabic and Persian tradition, and not much, maybe not at all, probably a little bit, affected by Indian traditions. It has been produced at the Bahmani court shortly before the Shalihotra translation, probably in 1410. The problem is that in the text there are two dates, but 1410 seems to be the correct date. It consists altogether of 100 chapters, 60 out of them are medicine. And so I cannot give the list of all the chapters, this would be too long, but it starts with the creation of horses, then talks about the color of horses, good and bad signs, the designation of specific horses, deficits of horses, and also very interesting, it has many chapters on how to become a good rider and the training of horses. And this is something I will look into in the future. I'm very much looking forward to do that because it sounds very interesting. What I discovered 2 days ago is that there is another text which is a Farasnama for a person probably called Nusrat ibn Shahriya Alari. I'm absolutely not sure about Alari, and I did not yet have the time to identify him. It was not so easy, so I postponed identifying this person. The text has been written in 767, and it turns out to be the same text. So our Khayyal-Nameh from the Bahmani court is a case of plagiarism, to be honest. But there is some difference in it because this text is a little bit shorter. It has only 33 chapters on medicine and not 60 chapters on medicine. So obviously, at the Bahmani court, some chapters on medicine have been added, so it's not a full case of plagiarism. If you look at the sources indicated, we see it's Arabic and Persian horse treatises. He relies to a certain extent to the Quran and Hadith. He refers to Tariq al-Tabari, but he does not refer to any Indian tradition. So the name Salutar or Shalihotra or whatever it is spelled like is not mentioned at all. And I assume that in the Khayyal-Nameh, some other medical material has been interpreted. That's to be checked in the future. So that is, let's say, a Khayyal-Nameh or Persian horse treatise, which seems to be unaffected by the Shalihotra translations. So if you look at the Shalihotra translations, my list becomes longer and longer. What we have and what I'm mostly going to talk about is Tarjumah Salutar from Gulbarga. So just a couple of years after the Khayyal-Nameh from 1410. We have the Qurat al-Mulk done for Khalji, Uda, and then we have the obviously influential text by Zain al-Abidin al-Karbelai done in Gujarat for Muzaffar Shah, which has been, let's say, copied or used as the basis for other translations, which are also, let's say, kind of plagiarism, by Firuz Jang, but also by a person called Abu Muhammad Sadiq Munshi. That's also a text I just saw 3 days ago. So I cannot say much about it, but it seems to be very much the same text, just by changing the introduction, as also this translation does. So obviously these texts were popular, and some people were asked by their patrons or kings to write a horse treatise or to translate a horse treatise, but they thought, why doing the job myself? There's already an existing horse treatise, let's just take it and save some time. It's already a very good horse treatise, and I just do and write another introduction. Please don't do that when you write a PhD thesis. It will be a failure. No. So that's quite interesting. A lot of intertextuality in these texts. We have also a horse treatise translated in the period of Jahangir, the Rahat al-Faras, and we have another translation done for Shah Jahan, which is called the Miftah al-Faras. And I would say probably there are more texts, but this is the list I have at the moment. And we can see that quite a few other Farasnamas have been influenced by the Shalihotra tradition, either directly by the Shalihotra in some way, or by using, and I think this is probably rather the case, by using some of these translated texts. So maybe I should explain what the Shalihotra is. I have used the word now a lot without saying something about it. The problem is, it's a little bit difficult to say anything about it. So the source text of the translation is a text called Shalihotra, and Shalihotra is the name of a person. He's supposed to have been the author of a text or maybe several texts on hepology. We don't know if and when he lived. Maybe during the 4th century, maybe only in the 10th century, so sometime between the 4th and the 10th century CE. And from his name has been derived, let's say, a popular designation or nomenclature for horse treatises. And we have, what makes, let's say, which is the terminus antiquem, is that we have a translation of the Shalihotra text into Tibetan in 992. So, at least in 992, a text called Shalihotra must have existed to be translated into Tibetan. So, this is for sure. All the rest is a little bit unknown. And then we have several horse treatises, and there are many more, but let's say probably the most important is the Ashwa Shastra of Nakula and the Shalihotra of Boja, and some others. And the problem is none of these texts corresponds to any of our translations. So if we look, for example, at the Bulgaga translation, and that's what I'm going to do, we see that there are quite a few discrepancies between, let's say, edited and translated texts of Nakula and Boja, and what we see in the Bulgaga text. So it would be very important to check the entire Sanskrit tradition of horse treatises, but that's something I cannot do. So this needs to be done in cooperation. So if we look at the Bulgaga translation, it's an interesting one because it's the earliest known translation of a long horse treatise. It is not the earliest translation of material on horses because in the Brat Samhita, the vast text on omens and prognostication, there is also a short passage of about 3-4 pages on horses, which have been translated in the period of Firoz Shah, and this is earlier. So some material obviously was already known and circulated in Persian. It has been done by Abdallah ibn Safi for Ahmad Wali in Bulgaria. And what makes this so challenging, this one translation, is that we have many copies of the text, really, and you find more. As the more you search, the more you find. And also there are some online sold in, sold and or put online somewhere. The problem is that these copies are not uniform, but there is a whole. There are many variants in the different texts. You can roughly say you have a short and a longer version, and the longer version has obviously been supplemented by material from other sources. I think mostly from the Arabic-Persian tradition, but yeah, this is. It's a little bit difficult because you have, I think I have at the moment 12 different copies of the text, and they are also not arranged in the same way, and so the comparison is a challenge in itself. And many have nice illustrations, so just to say why we needed a projector, you can see here some horses, and the manuscripts are full of these huge drawings of horses. And in other manuscripts, you see that the horses were supposed to be there, but the manuscripts were not finalized, so there's just an empty space for the horse, but the horse is not there. And sometimes also it is written the color of the horse is black or the color of the horse is white, but there is no horse, just a blank space. So obviously they were meant to be illustrated by the horses. What is the contents? You have something which I call the wing story, and I will use the wing story to explain a little bit the challenges in analyzing the translation, because the wing story is I think it's a nice story. And but we have material on omens, we have veterinary medicine, training of horses, the origin of horses, the age and the color of horses, etc. But before we look at the wing story, let's say something about the translator, because this is also interesting in the text. We have, just at the beginning of the text, some information about how the translation has been done. And I quote, "In the time of Sultan Ahmad Wali al-Bahmani, on the order of the world-protecting king, this humble servant, Abdallah ibn Safi, has rendered into Persian the translation of the Shalihotra by Durgadasa, the son of Sagarasi, resident of Almana." So what we can obviously see here is that two persons have been involved in the process. One is Abdallah ibn Safi, but the other is Durgadasa, and we don't have clear information how this cooperation worked. Was Durgadasa supposed to orally translate the text into whatever language, and Abdallah then translated from this oral translation the text into Persian and wrote it down? This seems like a probable process, but maybe Durgadasa also produced a written text. We just don't know it. We have more information about this, let's say, involvement of two persons in one of the other translations, which is the Quran and translations from the 15th century. And I quote from there. So this is how here the translator speaks about the translation process. "There was a master of the Hindawi language whom the ruler sent along with me. So he would be the translator of these words and would transmit the words from one language to the other. When we sat together face to face, he started to speak in Hindawi. He pronounced some unintelligible words, which I did not understand at all. My confusion rendered me quite hopeless. He was Marathi and I am from Khorasan. But since my king had ordered me to do so, my mind got access to the meaning. Ingeniously, with the help of reason and analogy, I found out all he said about the horses." And I like this introduction very much, thinking about these two people trying somehow to interact and to understand each other. And we have, of course, this famous picture used by Audrey Kruschke, who writes in her book on the translations that at the court of the Mughals, there were always, let's say, a translator team with Persian Hindu scholars working together, and also different terms used, the mutarjim used for the Persian side and the mu'awiyah for the Indian side. But this is a little bit later, and I think the material from the Sultanate period shows that this kind of cooperation and interaction existed already earlier and is here standing in a longer tradition, and we would very much like to know more about that, but yeah, it's, the information is, we can't get more information than what I just quoted to you. So, let's now look a little bit into what I call the wing story, to point to the challenges in comparing the different textual traditions. So let's first go to the Sanskrit tradition as we find it in the edition and translation of the Shalihotra by Nakula. He says, "Horses were originally created with wings and they were flying among the clouds. Indra was very much impressed with their nimbleness and considered them very useful in war." So we have here again immediately the war connection. "Without wings, they would be even more useful than elephants. So Indra considered taking away their wings." So here we have the horse. This is not such a good picture, but it was the only one from an Indian tradition, while all the others were from Persian traditions. And so he suggested Indra to Shalihotra, the master of horses, to chop the wings of the horses, and Shalihotra agreed. The horses, of course, didn't like that. They ran to their master for redress, but he told them that they are more useful for men without their wings. And he assured the horses to teach men all secrets of horses to make sure that men would treat the horses well. So that's what we find in Nakula. maybe. So if you look at the translation, what happens? In the translation, 2 horses had wings at the beginning, and that's different. In most other translations they don't have, but in the Bulgaria translation they have. God had shaped them with 4 wings and their 4 legs, and they were able to fly with them by their own strength. When the form of Adam was produced from clay, Iblis showed the form to the horses and warned them, saying, "Look at this. Man will produce saddle and bridle and will climb on your back and ride on you and give you commands. And you certainly do not like that." Huh? So what happens? The horses were not happy with that idea. So they tried to hinder the creation of Adam by destroying the clay before it became hard. Then they asked from where Saul is inserted into the clay and tried to spoil the region of the navel. God takes this spoiled clay and creates the dog out of it, and then protected his creation by the dogs, who chased away the horses when they tried to approach the mold out of which Adam was shaped. So then we come back to Shalihotra. In between mankind there was a wise man by the name of Shalihotra, a Hindu, who had a deep knowledge of horses. He cut the wings of the horses and cauterized them. The horses were then turned by God into beings without wings. The aim was that prophets, saints, and believers should be able to ride them. But then again, Shalihotra and his father had vast knowledge about them and their treatment, and then the book about the horse treatment is written. So, if we compare these 2 traditions, there are shared elements. Evidently, there are clearly shared elements. We have the horses with wings at the beginning. We have the use of horses by man, which is supposed to happen for war or for riding. And Shalihotra is the one who takes away the wings. And the book is the compensation for the loss of wings to make sure that men will treat horses well. Then we have some elements which show clear signs of Islamization. There's no role of Indra in the Bulgaria translation, and we have intrigues by the devil, Iblis, and the beneficial effect by Jibreel. I didn't mention him here, but Jibreel then is also involved in the process. But then we have also some quite strange elements which cannot really be explained by Islamization. In the beginning I tried to explain them by Islamization, but then I thought it does not really sound like Islamization. And the strange element is that the horses try to prevent the creation of Adam, and they try to take an active part in the creation process. And it's also interesting that the horses are primordially human. So where does this come from? Is this really something which has been changed in the process of translation? Or do we rather have to look for other Indian source texts? And this, I think, would be the better way. Because there's a folk tradition of the Munda from Nagpur, but from other tribes people too, and there's a study about that and a comparison of all these different tribal traditions about horses and the creation of man, which is very widespread in many different, let's say, shapes or nuances. But if we take the main information, we have that there is God and there's an opponent of God, and this opponent endangered the creation of man by destroying the clay human figures prepared by God, and he did so in the shape of a demonic horse. And so God protected the figures with dogs. I think this sounds very much familiar to what we just had in the Persian translation text. So subsequently the horses were turned into riding and pack animals to punish them. So what we can say is that here we have quite a few elements shared between the local folk tradition and the Persian version, and even more, our Persian version looks more even like the folk tradition than what is supposed to be Nakula's Shalihotra tradition. So we cannot say much about the transmission, but it makes much more sense to think that this there must have been a kind of horse treatise, including these local elements, which has been translated into Persian, than to think that these transformations have happened in the process of the translation. That would be, in my opinion, not very probable. So we definitely need to search for more Shalikotra traditions and manuscripts in different Indian languages to better understand it. So, now moorings. There are, as I showed you, there are more translated texts, and in one more of these translations, the Rahat al-Faras, we also have a wing story at the beginning. Interestingly, this whole book is in a Rahat al-Faras drawn back to a person called Nun Kaf Lam, and I think Nun Kaf Lam probably is Nakula. It makes very much sense to interpret it like this. So he is referring to Nakula. That would be the same text we just had. But here, if we compare, it is very much the similar story. So we have God who creates the horses with wings. They are again flying like birds through the sky. But now the Deves enter. It's not Indra who comes, but the lord of the Deves, who considers horses very useful for riding. And then it's the lord of the Deves who asks Shaluhatra to cut the wings, so it's not anymore Indra, but somehow the lord of the Deves, and Shaluhatra does so. And then again the horses come and complain and say, we didn't do anything wrong, why have our wings been cut? And Shaluhatra says, okay, I had to obey the ruler of the Deves, the lord of the Deves, I cannot disobey him, but I will teach people and mankind how to treat you well, and you will be the most blessed among the beings, the animals. So, we find moorings in the Islamic tradition. We find one version, but I think this version has somehow been adapted. We find one version in the Adab al-Harb al-Shuja'a, where also in the book, which is very much on war, we have a chapter on horses. Here we have horses flying around and coming down on earth to drink water at some water place in Khorasan. And people complain about them. Actually, I did not really understand why people complain, but I think the content of the complaint is that they empty the water and no water is left for people for drinking and irrigation. This seems to be the background, but for me until now it was not really clear why there are these complaints. And they complain with Salomo. And Salomo, and here comes all of a sudden again the Deves. He sends out the Deves to capture the horses, but the horses are much too fast. They cannot, so they run around and fly around, but the horses cannot be kept. So the Deves use a ruse. They empty the water out of this pond and replace it by wine. And so when the horses come and drink out of it, they become totally drunk and cannot escape anymore. And I was thinking about these drunk horses. But the poor drunk horses are then captured by the Deves, and then what happens? They are brought to Suleiman, and Suleiman starts killing the horses. And when he has killed 900 out of them, God interferes and asks Suleiman to stop killing the horses. So 100 horses are preserved, their wings are cut, and all horses descend from these 100 horses. And they again become the mount of prophets, kings, and the nobility. And I am still searching, and I will continue searching. This story is a strange story, because Salomo is usually a person very kind towards all animals. He has a very, let's say, very kind and pleasant relationship with animals, but all of a sudden he is turned here into somebody who kills the horses. This does not fit to the Islamic, let's see, idea about Solomon and animals. So I very much wonder to what extent this wing story might again have been influenced by the Shalikotra tradition, as we just had it in the Rahat al-Faras, where we also have the Deves involved, the Deves who tried to capture the horses, and but still it's not exactly the same, and I will have to search also in Arabic material if Solomon ever has this role of killing horses, which I think does not fit to his the usual image of Solomon. So I have somehow the impression that Solomon is here replacing Cleopatra. But this is a hypothesis. You can very much criticize me for that. It's, as I said, it's work in progress. So, but there is one more version on horses. Again, we have the horses flying around. They disappear again, Solomon, and fly away. But here in this story, Solomon sets in motion a long process to bring the horses back to earth. So fire and wind and sun and moon, angel and houris attempt to capture the horses. They all do not manage. So in the end, God is involved. He orders the horses to return to earth, and the horses obey. This again resembles somehow the story we just had, but here there is again a difference, because in the process of escaping, the horses were injured when the houris and the sun, etc., tried to catch them, and these wounds are transformed into pages. And what are pages? Pages are small swellings on the body of a horse. And the purpose of this story here is somehow to explain where the pages come from. And again, I don't yet know the background of the story. We see how these stories are transformed, and they resemble each other, but they are again different elements. But I show you a miniature painting or a miniature of horses with pages. You see here these swellings, and these pages seem to belong, by page is a Persian word, but they seem to belong rather to an Indic tradition, because if you look at the explanations given, there are always some Indian terminology used there. So I think it belongs rather to this tradition. And we also have similar drawings with Devanagari script. But again, it's not really possible to say at the moment which is antedating which and which is postdating which. So it is just to show you we really have these swellings and explanations in both languages, and both used for prognostication. And this brings us to a part or to some topic very much dealt with in all horse traditions, which is horses used for prognostication. But let us, before briefly talking about that, return to the Khayyam and what I consider is the Arabic Persian tradition of horses, in which all these stories of Solomon and of wings, etc., are not in. So the horses are there created from wind and water, and that's it. So we don't have anything related to flying around, punishments, etc. And we should also say that I have the impression, okay, horses are associated with war, but usually in the Arabic tradition, in the Persian tradition, in the Islamic tradition, horses have an extremely positive image. So horses are the best of creatures. We have all these prizeful words on horses from the Hadith, quotation from the Prophet, from Ashab, praise people who sit on horses, say riding is the best what you can do, and treating horses well is also a very laudable activity, etc., etc. And of course, we also have a kind of flying horse in the Arabic Islamic tradition, which is also a very positive being, which is the burak, but it's slightly different from the horses we were talking about, because the burak indeed is a winged creature, but it has also some human elements in it. So it is not exactly a flying horse, but it's a very specific flying creature related to horses. So only very briefly something about the use of humans, and I think this is something which shows again how difficult it is to identify from where which elements come. because horses are used for prognostication, or omens are taken from horses, and in the Hayanamen, so the text from the Brahmanic thought, omens are taken from the color of horses. So we say horses, let's say, which are completely black but which have white feet are good for war or are good for riding for the king. But if you take a horse which has only one white feet, you will die. And then there's even an interesting story in one of the texts, I think it was in Rahat of Faras, that people, so the Turks, so the Arabs know that the horses with this specific white feet are very bad for riding. The Turks don't believe it, so in a war they are fighting together against an enemy, and the Arabs say, no, 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 don't paint this horse. The Turks say, yes, it's a good horse, let's use it. And what happens? Everybody escapes, there's a difficult situation, but the person riding this specific horse is killed, and then the Turks still don't believe it, and another one takes the horse, and again a critical situation arises, and then one of the Arabs comes and kills the horse, and they are victorious afterwards. So this is the kind of story you find, and nice contrast also between the Arabs and the Turks with regard to horses. So we have this kind of, let's say, omens or prognostication based on the color of horses. This seems to be indeed a tradition from the Arabic Persian world. But then we have also omens taken from hair patterns. And I'm not sure if you all know what kind of hair patterns horses have, because horses, you know, the shape of the hair forms some swirls, if you want to have this probably most famous or best known swirl, which is on the front of a horse, which can also be two swirls, but you have also hair patterns, wall patterns on the back or on any body part of the horse, where, let's say, the direction of the hair changes. And this is very critical for horses. And if you want to walk, I didn't know that. I hardly have anything to do with horses in my normal life, outside my scholarly life. And when I wanted to know what it looks like, I was, you know, to use Google and show me pictures of horses. And if you search for swirlology, you will really be amazed. Swirlology is the keyword for today's riders who still believe in the function of these omens taken from hair patterns. There's a whole bunch of riders who still think that this gives you a clue about the character of the horse. We find, interestingly, this also in the Hayalama already. It doesn't use the later terminology, but it says something about Mui Baham Krishide. While, and it points to circles and lines, but the term we later always find is Bunre or avatar in different shapes. And we find this term in almost all later Indo-Persian texts. They have really a huge amount of material on these Bunre. And we even find it in Persian texts in Central Asia. So for me at the moment, I have to find out if all these traditions, even when they do not yet use the term Bunre, if there's an independent Arabic Persian tradition on prognostication from hair patterns, or if in the Hayyaname, which is earlier than the earliest translation, already we find some Shalihotra material without this being indicated in any way. I believe rather the second is the case. I think there must be maybe via the Braj Samhita translation, because in the Braj Samhita translation we have these short chapter on horses and very short notions about hair patterns. So it could have migrated into the Indo-Persian treatises via Braj Samhita or via material we do not know. If we look in the Adab al-Harad wa Shajar, which is earlier, we see the importance of colors, but we don't see bunris and avatars at all. So maybe, and that's a good question, we have either there were more translations we don't yet know, we will maybe never discover, produced between the 7th and the 8th, 9th century, or we have an independent tradition, but then it should also be in Arab treatises and Persian treatises, which are not affected by any Indian material, and that's a task for the future to check. But as I said, I saw it in material from Central Asia, but I think this material from Central Asia was affected by the Shalihotra tradition, because at some moment the word Shalihotra is mentioned. This is quite obvious. But you see, there's still much to do, and so what will be my task in the near future? It will be, first of all, to read all the manuscripts which I have collected during the last 4 weeks, and it's really a lot. But I realized, while I thought in the beginning, there are so many different treatises. Yes, there are many different treatises, but the more I read, the more it's repetitive. So when I was now in Rampur, I take one text and say, ah, that's this one. It is always says in the catalog only Farasname. Often you don't get any further information, but the moment you start reading the book, you say, okay, that's this one, that's that one, that's this one, and that's a new one. And so in the end, I think the material or the number of different treatises is not that high. Maybe something between 10 and 20 different treatises. That's my current estimation. And there are, of course, many other topics about which I didn't talk here, which can be compared. What I'm really interested in is the training of horses, but also the colors, which seem to be very much an Arabic tradition of prognostication. Teeth and age, it's very difficult because it seems to be so close to two traditions. I mean, obviously it's related to medicine, and the number of teeth and the color of teeth change with every year of the horse, and you can immediately say this horse has 19 years and this horse has 10 years, and this is the same in India and in Iran, so probably the material of teeth will be very similar. The medical part would be interesting, but that's probably something I better leave to somebody who's really an expert in veterinary medicine, like my colleague Fabrizio Speciale. And what I'm really interested in is to see this text as a living text, and I think this gives us a clue about the importance of horses, because the text, once translated, is not just left as it is and copied in the shape it has, but the text develops a life on its own, as we can best see in the Gulbaga translation, just attracting material from all kinds of other sources. And we have also seen that several of the translations have been reproduced and reused. So this story of the living text and how the text develops in the course of time, and how maybe parts of it then also are used in later texts, maybe from the 18th, 19th century, without referring to it, but just using it because it has become an important part of, let's say, the horse culture here. This is something I will look at I will look into in the future, and if I come back in maybe 2 years, I can say much more about it. It will maybe not be any more work in progress, but a complete lecture. But that's what I have for today. And so, thank you for your attention.
So, thank you, ma'am, for your wonderful lecture.
You could change
I'm happy, Stan. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for your very wonderful and enriching lecture. I hope that the minds of audience sitting here are racing just like the horses you have shown. So now I open the house for the questions.
So, thank you for this really sort of mesmerizing presentation. As you said, today we know very little about horses, unless you actually happen to be a specialist. And my own knowledge is largely, initial knowledge is largely derived from novels of the 19th century where they are such an important presence. So our real, I mean, we've seen actually very few horses. Thank you for sort of taking us through this world of horses through Indo-Persian texts and linking them with earlier traditions. I think it is you started with this Shalihotra tradition, but I think this is the way in which you have linked particularly the wind legend, which I think is a very, very important insight, and a highly evolved legend, or rather I should say several versions of that legend, to folk and the complexity of those versions, to folk traditions, to Indo-Persian texts, to Arabic texts, to Indic texts. I think that is particularly when you sort of brought in the folk traditions and how they might have influenced these, the story and been a mode of transmitting some of the elements of that legend from earlier texts to the Indo-Persian texts. Now, when you refer to that statement that with wings in that sort of legend, the horses would be even more useful than elephants. I think that's such a crucial statement because that takes us to the heart of the matter, of the significance of the horse to medieval society and pre-medieval society as well. And I'm reminded, of course, of that, this link that is there between elephants and horses in the statement of that great classic Simon Digby's work on horses and elephants in Delhi Sultanate, and another more recent classic, Orthmann's Elephants and Kings, which actually begins with the statement that Simon Digby's horses and elephants is a great favorite of mine. Now, I think in linking all these traditions, or sort of looking at the roots of these traditions, or how there were several sources of these traditions. I think Trautmann's work is particularly important because the way Trautmann looks at a longer tradition of both treatises on horses. I mean, his title is a little modest, although the focus is elephants, but it has a lot to say about, building on Digby's argument. There's a lot to say about horses, and there's one particular chapter which I especially like in that Trautmann book, where he looks at the Arthashastra and the Ain, and looks at the commonalities between the two in their understanding of horses, maintenance, training, fodder, nutrition, and also makes that very important point that both these texts have seen there are also not just commonalities between these two texts. So there's obviously the Ain is sort of incorporating an older tradition, or rather several older traditions, but also the link that he makes between bullocks, horses, and elephants, to make the point that there are so many similarities in nourishment and so on, nutrition and fodder and so on, that you only have to kind of step up and step down, what is required, or means the scale is very different. Now, in that context, my one thing which struck me, and that might be something which I would correct on that, whether in the light of what Trautmann has to say, you placed the Shalihotra tradition in the 4th century AD. I'm just wondering, whether the Shalihotra tradition itself incorporates older Indic traditions, which is not entirely sort of, something that would be surprising. So that's one thing, which I would be happy if you could share your views of that. There's the other tradition which you referred to in passing, which is Central Asian. And Central Asian, makes me also think of the way the horse was so crucial to Mongol expansion. So whether their sort of perception of horses, even if there are no written treatises of an earlier phase of their history, whether they would have, the ways they might have influenced the Indo-Persian text. And in talking of veterinary sort of aspects of looking after the horse, there's one other tradition which I thought if one could look at, which is texts in Latin. Since the Portuguese in particular themselves, in India, managed to access a lot of texts which they then translated into Latin. What kind of influence that? And just something that was kind of this is loud thinking, but I'm just wondering. So for me, what you said, the diversity of these traditions and how they come together with several sort of modifications, new elements by the time you come to the 15th century, 16th century. I think that was something which really was so important. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments. And maybe let me just take up one point. Yes, of course, talking about horses, the elephant is just around the corner, let's say that, or standing behind. What makes, I think, the traditions slightly different is that when we have a field name, we can be sure it is based on Indian material, because we don't have an Arabic tradition of field nama,
Sure.
and we also don't have a Persian tradition of field nama. We have, of course, we had elephants at the Ghaznavi port, so they could be from there, but there is also nothing really on elephants. So that makes it so if we have a Kursi Nama or Fir Nama, we don't have this extreme rich intertextuality. But it is, to the best of my knowledge, I have also now taken some copies from Kursi Nama, but this I will investigate when I'm back to Göttingen. But I have the impression this, let's say, living tradition with enrichment from all over the time, coming from all different kinds of sources, is a phenomenon which is more particular to the first treatises. So that's why I reduced it here to the other, also because of shortness of time. But of course, the phenomenon is very interesting. And about the Indian or Indic Shalihotra tradition, I was now basing my argument on a scholar. She is what's her name? Maura is her second name, Petra Maura, and she has worked on these translations into Tibetan. And she is very much working, let's say, on this tradition of horses, and also she has looked a little bit into the Chinese tradition, which would be another, let's say, another thread to follow, because especially for her in Tibetan tradition, there is a Chinese influence also. And she has argued about the Indian tradition and traced it back to the 4th century, but if there's evidence for earlier, this is nothing I'm involved in, I'm just copying or quoting what I find. So there might be, of course, earlier materials which have been integrated. So no doubt about that. I mean, there are traditions tracing back Shalihotra back to the Vedic age. This seems to be a legend and not so much plausible, but so she argued that it's more plausible to have him somehow after the 4th century, but of course there might be earlier material, no doubt about that. So about the Central Asian tradition, it good to, I do not know if we have Mongolian treatises in Mongolian language about horses. They might have produced them in Persian or in Chinese. But looking at this Central Asian tradition, I was a little bit disappointed, honestly, when I was in Tashkent this year and was looking at horse treatises, and I hoped to find much more, but the number of horse treatises there, at least in the Albioni Institute, was not that high. And at least one of them, rather two of them, had been influenced by the Shalihotra tradition. So this was not a rich source. But of course, there might be the horse treatises in from the Mongolian tradition in Iran. So looking, this will be, let's say, the next step probably will be to look at horse treatises in Iranian manuscript departments, which is of course at the moment completely impossible, because at the moment we can definitely not go to Iran, and let's see whether it will be possible again. Fortunately enough, we have some online manuscripts, so that will be an option to look at that. And of course, we have also copies from Iran in London, in Berlin, in other libraries. So that will be definitely a way to look at it, and also to trying to find out if they, to what extent they are influenced by the Mongolian tradition, which is of course something very to be expected, very much to be expected. So, what was the third question?
About the Latin text.
About the Latin
and
text.
The Portuguese.
This I did not yet do. I know, of course, that we have the British who are interested in the horse treatises, and we have an early English translation of the Shalihotra by Firoz Jan. But I never heard about translations done into Latin and Portuguese, but yeah, that is something to be looked at. Thank you. I did not think about it honestly, but I will check. Yeah.
Also because of the proximity of the Deccan kingdoms,
Yes.
like the Brahmins and all, to Portuguese territory.
Yeah, they could easily have done that. The question is, was it interesting for them to bring it back to Portugal, because at least the veterinary part they did not really need. But yeah, it will be interesting to check, because honestly, when this is something I just said. So I am not very much an expert on horses, but when I like these chapters on how to feed a newborn horse or young horse, and the amount of ghee and sugar they get doesn't seem to be really the healthy treatment of horses, but they must be fat like that. And I read also in some scholarly work on that the fodder horses got in India sounds quite strange to people who are experts on horses. Really, they are fed by ghee. So, yeah.
Actually, I'll use my position as chair to mention that one of our very eminent economic historians, Professor Shuman Guha, who's at Uta, he wrote something on horses, and he actually, in the context of 19th century and one of the things he did was to learn how to ride a horse. So he said, I can't really ride a horse. So I think we need to actually know a horse in real life.
Yeah, that's true. And fortunately enough, in my place in Göttingen, there are quite a few horses, and not so far even from where I live. So I was indeed, as a young person I was riding, but then I gave up a long time ago, but I thought maybe I should do it again and practice it a little bit, because it might help in understanding these treatises, to be closer to horses. And it would not be difficult because there are really many horses around. But yeah, honestly, I'm a little bit afraid to sit on a horseback. But maybe it would be an idea.
Yeah,
I could even the Shariutra tradition manuscripts in Uzbekistan. The manuscripts which went to Europe and others in Shariutra, many of which were illustrated, like the one even in Hindi in Welcome Trust and others. But in Tashkent, finding this kind of a manuscript that shows that they were using it, especially for the veterinary science. And those were also illustrated. People who were carrying it to Europe and other librarians, one could understand that they carried it. But these manuscripts in Tashkent and in Bukhara, in fact only one manuscript is there and then they made copy of it. So this Shariutra was not confined to India, it went to Central Asia also, which is itself a hub of the horses. We know that Chinese were getting horses in place of money as a tribute from them. They had the horses and still they were using Shariutra traditions for veterinary sciences, this Indian tradition. This is another aspect of the Shariutra tradition.
Thank you.
She has done a good job for last many years.
Yeah.
We say research in progress, so every time she adds something.
Yeah, actually mine is very small, but it is very, very fascinating. I tend to think ancient, by area of work. And so, in the context of the popularity or the prevalence of the Shariutra tradition, it made me wonder why the Ashwamedha or the Ucheshravas legends are they referred to anywhere in the Persian translations? Do these terms come anywhere? About Ucheshravas, or which is in the Mahabharata, in the churning of the ocean, or the very prevalent and politically important Ashwamedh sacrifice, that too doesn't find place.
No.
So that's also an interesting thought, that why these never entered into the medieval Persian literature, but the Shariutra tradition carried forward.
Yeah, that's interesting. That is indeed an interesting question. These terms I did not yet come across. Maybe in the future I will find it, but it might be that they just left it out because it was something too far or for which they didn't have any use, or it was too strange to them, or yeah.
Another way to think you from her. There were two types of horses coming from abroad, and especially like in Kathiawar or Sindhi Ghodas. They were basically the indigenous, as we mentioned. And many years the horses were sacrificed. So that means the horse tradition was there already. But taking this Shariutra, especially for veterinary sciences, to this Bahri and Kuhi, which you mentioned, from those which were being brought from Central Asia, from the Arabian Steppe. So they were using Indian medical system for it.
Yeah.
That was, these horses would have become acclimatized to Indian weather.
Yeah, I mean, this was a big problem, and if you look at let's say, more the topics related to horse trade, we also learned that in the business of bringing horses to India, many died. I mean, what that made the horses expensive, either they were shipped over on the dhow, and they didn't like being transported on the dhow, no, they didn't like it. And so not all the horses survived, and also, or they were brought from Central Asia, but we can also, in some sources, say that the horse traders forced the buyers to buy not single horses, but let's say the horses in hundreds, so they get a whole bunch of 100 horses and couldn't select the good ones. but just had to take the 100 horses, so this is your slot and you take it or you forget about it.
Yeah.
So, which shows also that the horse traders obviously could dictate the rules, and it was a very important business, but also some of those horses who had been transported from Central Asia, when they arrived in India, were not in a good condition. And then they had somehow to adapt to the climate and the fodder, the ghee, and diet also again. So not all the horses you bought would survive the first month. And so that made it expensive, yeah. But since there was so much a need, especially for war and representation, that's Nevertheless, the buyers bought them. And what will be interesting, I would also like to counter-check this material from the archives in Hyderabad, where we have in the archival documents the description of horses and what they look like, which is in a very standardized terminology. But I looked at this material only briefly, and so there's much more left.
So, I really want to maybe quickly, because there's so much interest being generated, maybe do more questions, and then perhaps we can talk over tea. Tea ready or tea or something?
We can continue.
We can continue.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so Akash and Yasir also wants to.
Ma'am, I wanted to ask about somehow, pre-Bahmanid times that you had mentioned about it, the translation about the pre-Bahmanid times.
Yes.
If we think about the times of the Khiljis, that when they were into the expansion into the Deccan, and we see a very developed foundation of the tradition of putting a tag on the horses, like
Yes.
branding of the
Yes.
horses, and you also see the incipient manner of